But right now I'm using 6, and I could do them real quickly. And the percentage of scholars who are going to agree to this are in the 90-something percentile. And when you say, well, how do you know that? I say because I counted. I counted the guys. More about that later if you want to talk about it. Here's the 6. Jesus died by crucifixion.
All right, so number 1 is Jesus died by crucifixion. What do we have to support this conclusion? Well, what we have is Paul as our earliest source claiming that Jesus, or Christ rather, was crucified. What was Paul's source? Paul's sources are visions and reading the scriptures. So Paul didn't actually see Christ get resurrected. Well, did he talk to anybody that could have seen Christ or Jesus being crucified and then also resurrected? No. In Paul's writings, he makes it very clear that one of the central tenets of his theology is that he did not get his information from anybody here on earth. He only got it through visions of Jesus and the scriptures. If he would have gotten it from anybody here on earth, that would have invalidated him as a trustworthy source for the things that Jesus has supposedly said. So it's completely antithetical to Paul to say that he got his information from any human source, when he very clearly delineates himself from human sources. Now, these guys would also include the Gospels as like eyewitness testimony, but those are not eyewitness testimonies. They do not claim to be eyewitness testimonies, and the timeline in which they were written do not allow them to be written by eyewitnesses. None of them claim to even know eyewitnesses. In fact, we don't get names for these Gospels until like the later part of the 2nd century. Up until that point, they were completely anonymous. Nobody knew who wrote them. So ultimately, the evidence for Jesus being crucified is really just Paul having a hallucination of Jesus telling him that he was crucified. That isn't direct evidence and is akin to listening to the crazy guy on the street. Okay, next fact.
The disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. Habermas says it's absolutely incontrovertible. He said it's proven by history. Okay, they had experiences that they believed the risen Jesus.
So, yes, I would agree that the apostles claim to have gotten visions from Jesus. And we learn this from Paul because he very plainly lays out how you became an apostle, and that's by getting a vision of Jesus. So, while I don't contest this fact, I also say that this fact does not get us back to an actual resurrection. All this does is gets us to the belief in when it formed.
It was proclaimed very early. You know, when I first started doing this, Cameron, they put that date. Critics would put that date and say, maybe Paul got it in Jerusalem at +5 years after the cross. We are way back on that. Habermas says there are a bunch of New Testament texts from sermon summaries and early creeds that can be dated 1 to 2 years after the cross. Jimmy Dunn, as influential as any New Testament scholar, says the Creed in 1 Corinthians 15:3 may have been dated by the end of the same year Jesus was crucified. That would give about 9 months for that thing to come about. So early. That's number 3.
So, again, just like with the last one, I don't really contest that the Pauline Creed, the creed that's found in 1 Corinthians 15:3-8, was developed pretty early, in the 30s. That does not get us to resurrection actually happened. That maybe gets us to when the belief started to become popular among, Jews and Gentiles maybe, but it does not get us to an actual resurrection. Just because a belief started at a certain point does not mean that whatever event that they supposedly believe in actually happened. We would need direct evidence in order to suggest that it happened. Or we don't even have to have direct evidence, actually. We could have evidence that could suggest, highly likely, that it did happen. The problem is that we don't have any evidence, either circumstantial or indirect. All right, so that's fact number 3. What is fact number 4?
Number 4, they turned the world upside down. To what extent? Well, I don't argue that we have to prove the disciples died as martyrs, but I do think that some of the key ones did. We have good first-century data, and all the ones we know about were willing to die. Now, you can say, well, how do you know? You can't read minds. I'm not reading minds. I'm looking at actions. And if you continually go into the roughest places and you continually get beat up and you, like Paul, get stoned and your followers think you're dead and you keep going back to the same place, that means you're willing to die for that message. And if the message stays the same, which in the New Testament is always minimum, factual side, minimum, deity, death, resurrection of Jesus, then and you're turned on by that, that's cool.
So just because a belief became popular, that means that a resurrection actually happened? I mean, even today it's popular to believe that aliens actually crash landed over in Roswell, New Mexico. That's not what happened, but it's still a popular belief now. But not even right now. It was popular in a shorter time span than the Gospels were written. Also, in this particular section, he talked about how the disciples died as martyrs. We have no evidence that disciples ever existed. The disciples were actually invented with the Gospels. Paul only mentions apostles, because I know that you're thinking, oh, well, he met Peter in Jerusalem, and he met James, and these people were disciples. Paul never says that these people were disciples. He only references them as apostles. Apostles are very different than disciples. You see, disciples were those people that actually knew Jesus, walked with him, and whom Jesus taught, while apostles merely got a vision of Jesus after he supposedly resurrected. And do we have any evidence that even apostles were martyred? No, we don't. What he's referencing here is the supposed martyrdom of Paul and Peter. And there's a lot of contention that goes on around where and when they died. But this is all because it's coming from second century sources who were just assuming and proclaiming that these things happened in the past. Obviously, there have been martyred Christians in the past, but none of the people that were martyred actually walked with Jesus. They came into the faith later and they fully believed in it. So you can't use their deaths in some kind of they wouldn't die for a lie argument.
The last two, 5 and 6, are the two skeptics. James is not established as well as Paul, but that James and Paul both have this characteristic. They both became Christians, as far as Paul for sure and James probably became Christians because of what they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus.
And again, as we've seen throughout this list, all Gary Habermas does is trace it back to a belief. A belief can't actually get us to the resurrection. Just because somebody has believed in something doesn't mean that actual something has happened. I don't care if James and Paul both became Christian because they had a vision of Jesus. That does not mean that Jesus actually resurrected. So what do these 6 bits of evidence actually prove as far as the resurrection goes? Well, the most that you could say is that the belief that Jesus resurrected started in the 30s. I'll even go as far as to say the early 30s. But that's as far as you can go with these minimal facts, establishing the start of the belief. Gary makes the logical leap of getting to a resurrection through these facts.